Good morning, everybody. We are going to start this panel. I hope you have enjoyed last night's dinner as much as I did, and almost as much as Steve did. And I'm giving the floor right now to Martha to introduce this panel. And indeed.
Good morning, everyone. As you know, I'm Reineke, and we need no introductions, which is sort of pervasive here. My colleagues, Wolfgang, Palaver, and Duncan, Morrow, are inviting you to join us in a conversation this morning about peace and conflict. And to ask why are we having this conversation, obviously, we don't just have hot spots in the world is on fire. We may not agree on the specifics of exactly what is wrong, why, and where, but things are not okay. So the three of us submitted a proposal for a conversation out of an expressed desire to participate with you in the belief that mimetic theory can helpfully inform conversation about peace and conflict. But we also asked for this time out of an appreciation for what we do not share in common. Wolfgang, Duncan, and I each stand in a different place when we think about conflict, okay? And each of you do too. Our distinct locations in the world make a difference in what we see as conflict, how we understand it, and how we respond to it. That said, we're wary of making silos of our very locations that isolate us from each other. Bunker mentalities are neither helpful nor wise. We, in preparing for this session this morning, see it as an invitation to draw on our shared knowledge of mimetic theory to support open inquiry about conflict. The three of us are committed question askers, even as we acknowledge that answers do not easily emerge from investigations into conflict. In light of that, disagreements that arise this hour may actually prove helpful if they turn us away from facile responses and toward ever more substantive engagement with the problem of conflict. Our format, each of us will offer a few reflections to hopefully help you think about the reflections you want to make. And then we will ask you to pair to consider a couple of questions we're going to give you and talk in twos or threes for about 10 minutes. And then we're going to ask for volunteers from your paired groups to share some insights. This strategy pedagogically enables us to get a broader spectrum of perspectives than going immediately to a conversation between one of you and the three of us. And we're looking forward to a substantive engagement. So we'll be putting these questions back up as soon as I'm done with my own presentation. And these are the ones we invite you to think about. So you don't have to write them down because they're going to appear in about 12 minutes back up on the screen. And they'll be there for you to think about the whole time you're listening to. Okay, and Duncan. Okay, so now we need my presentation. So the title, Western NBTA and Mimetic Theory. In support of our conversation about peace and conflict, I will reflect on how nonviolent direct action, hereafter NBTA, there's a definition there for you, functions as a powerful response to conflict. I will suggest that the deployment of a rational strategy or tactic does not make NBTA effective. Rather, nonviolence becomes an effective intervention when it is a way of life shared with others and probed for its creative potential. I will draw on one case study on critical social theory and on mimetic theory to make my point. My argument has implications for people who are committed to NBTA especially because NVDA resources primarily emphasize tactical training. Here's representative slides from websites. Left out of the manuals is the heartbeat of nonviolence, its embodied and lived expression in the lives of its practitioners. Yet the most successful NVDA in U.S. history, the movement to end segregation, achieved its goals because tactics were undergirded by the lived expression of nonviolence in its proponents' lives. My research on Bayard Rustin offers a case study. He was a leader in the U.S. civil rights movement. Until recently, because he was openly gay throughout his life, he was not well known outside of Quaker circles. Yet Rustin played a key role from 1942 through 1967 in NVDA aimed at segregation. He was a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr., writing many of King's speeches. And Rustin planned the March on Washington, which created public pressure on Congress and the President sufficient to force the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In describing Rustin's commitment to NVDA, scholars append the adjective Gandhian to their description, rendering the Quaker influence on Rustin's activism all but invisible. Yet the civil rights movement, to which he made significant contributions, was built across multiple generations, constructed brick by brick in communities that unified under the common roof of prophetic Christianity, of which Quakerism is one instance. Gandhian strategies for NVDA proved inspirational and of strategic value, but the faith tradition that inspired Rustin and his kin was not borrowed from the cultural and religious traditions of India or South Africa. I don't care to argue whether Gandhi or Quakerism most influenced Rustin. Rather, I want to show that scholars' all but complete neglect of his Quakerism exposes a key misunderstanding about the conditions necessary for NVDA. The Rustin case offers compelling evidence that NVDA is not primarily a technique. Rather, the capacity to engage in it originates in and is nurtured by one's participation in a community that embodies nonviolence. Rustin successfully implemented tactics borrowed from Gandhi because his capacity for NVDA had been grounded in and nurtured by his Quaker community. Time constraints allow for only one example: interracial institutes Rustin organized. He said of these workshops that Black and white young people who attended expressed impatience with his curriculum. The more quickly Rustin could teach them the techniques of NVDA, the sooner they could join protests and reap the results. Armed with techniques, they would be more powerful and more effective protesting non-violently than violently. I would add that in the current campus protests against the Israeli government's war against Hamas, we hear echoes of the same enthusiasm for technique. While it's wonderful that there is such confidence in nonviolent tactics, it also suggests that Rustin's comments are still relevant today. Rustin had to persuade his institute participants that the entire curriculum was critical to success, and these other features were indebted to Rustin's Quaker faith. These features do not announce themselves through appeal to doctrines, creeds, or theology authorized by church authorities. Quakerism has none of these, which may account for scholars' inattention to Quaker influences on Rustin. But mimetic theory and the concept of habitus, developed by Pierre Bourdieu, does bring Rustin's Quakerism and its role in NVDA into focus. Let's look at habitus. Bourdieu describes it as an embodied history, the experiences we internalize so that they seem like second nature. The central feature is spontaneity without consciousness. Absent both mechanical necessity and deliberative choice, habitus is a practical sense well illustrated by the phrase, a feel for the game. Athletes demonstrate a feel for the game when they anticipate moves, intuitively gauge risks, and press their luck. With board games, players familiar with the rules no longer tether their play to choices spelled out in an instruction booklet. Their play becomes ever more spontaneous and intuitive. Nick Crossley, a social theorist influenced by Bourdieu, suggests that the concept of habitus does not account well for human agency, particularly the agency of those involved in movements for social change. Bourdieu would have difficulty accounting for how challenges to Jim Crow emerged, how Rustin and other leaders could even conceive of plays in the game that would have as their goal ending segregation. Crossley develops the idea of radical habitus, focusing on the generative capacity of habitus to modify situations. Citing Merleau-Ponty, he argues for the primacy of practical over reflective forms of being. We have a grip on the world before we come to know it. A pre-reflective sense of environment establishes how embodied beings are agents in the world. Crucially, Merleau-Ponty adds the human capacity to take a point of view to the schema. Discussing how people develop solidarity with others to enact change, Merleau-Ponty suggests that agency emerges from the point of view of a group. We become aware of how we navigate our world, reflexively noting our grip on it, because other people mirror back to us our habitus, aspects of ourselves that we live rather than see. This capacity for reflexivity, carried for us by the other, can be a source of innovation and creativity. Who are agents of change? They're not people who make spontaneous choices out of the blue. They don't stand above history. Rather, they see in relationship with each other that some actions manifest a degree of creativity and innovation that effectively deforms or transforms the habitual. Mimetic theory sheds light on the mirroring functions of radical habitus. It explains a human's desire according to the desire of the other because humans lack being. Anticipating that the other possesses more, humans look to the sources of being to fill this constitutive lack. The notion of race elicits investment from the desiring human, precisely because, like other strategies of desire, it promises access to being itself. We can become more human, fuller, less lacking. And like all other strategies, the cost is high. Mimetic rivalries develop. The one who has modeled the fullness of being becomes a monstrous double who is repulsive. Race, the concept and notion of race, protects against an emerging crisis when it attempts a fantasy of wholeness using a discourse of visibility that fixes the other in place, locking the other on a mirrored surface. But this act becomes a source of profound anxiety. What if the lock doesn't hold? Racism, shared by those in the throes of the habitus of whiteness, acts to contain anxiety, making sacrifice a less likely outcome of the mimetic crisis. The habitus of whiteness is more than a social construction. Were racism an expression of false consciousness, then racial practices by which white people have pinned black people in a mirrored state of subjugation could be challenged and their power neutralized through education alone. But there is a lack of a lack in this space. The radical habitus of Rustin's Quaker faith enabled him to participate in and replicate for others mirroring practices capable of neutralizing anxiety on which racism feeds. Already as a young man, Rustin had given evidence of his feel for that game when he wrote to fellow Quakers in the 15th Street meeting in New York City, describing the peculiar social responsibilities of Friends. And in the box there, he's citing Peter 2, verse 9. He asked them to maintain the peace testimony and specified that they would do so by, quote, expending their energies in developing a creative method of dealing nonviolently with conflict. Friends have and can share a pattern for a way of life that can do away with the occasion of war, he wrote. Rustin's interracial institutes were experiments in sharing this pattern with others. Rather than focus on technique, the institutes prioritized the creation of interracial fellowship. Rustin believed that before the group could challenge Jim Crow at a lunch counter, they needed to create a brotherhood. The curriculum he created attested both to the pattern of Quaker habitus and to its radical possibilities. Rustin used songs and stories to engage participants in creative habitus that would draw out the past on behalf of a new humanity. Rustin wrote, "Nonviolence is more than direct action during protests. That action is possible only because of prior steps taken in millions of ways, which have been going on throughout the course of history. Practitioners must have," he wrote, "no fear, tell the truth, admit their own share of guilt in order to behave creatively. Practices such as praying daily, participating in a small group or cell, and simplifying one's life, all features of Quaker habitus, will lead authentic actions with others." Rustin attached an example of Jesus' actions to each of his recommendations in the institutes. Were NVDA to be approached in the institutes simply as a set of tactics which the young people who attended urged, Rustin warned the sources of injustice would remain unchallenged. NVDA does not begin when someone signs up for NVDA training, for a march or a sit-in, and nonviolence will not take greater hold in the world through more such sign-ups. Rather, effective NVDA follows upon joining a community in which a pattern of life has taken hold that sees that of God in everyone. This radical habitus of a mutual recognition of a common humanity is what we Girardians call positive mimesis. So we're going to go back to the question slide, and again, our goal here is, with our three presentations, to stimulate your reflection on your own placement in the conversation on peace and conflict. So we're going to put the questions back up, and you can reflect as you listen first to Wolfgang and then to Duncan for inspiration for your reflections. Wolfgang.
Yeah, thank you, Marty. I would like to give a brief outline how René Girard's mimetic theory relates to politics, and I do it as a student of Jesuits as learned in 3 steps. So my first step, René Girard has always been quite reluctant to be drawn into partisan politics. We can see that already in his first book, Deceit, Desire and Order, where he shows how party rule and party politics are deeply governed by internal mediation. He shows it first with the help of Stendhal and remarks, I quote, "We should not look for any partisan lesson in Stendhal's masterpieces. To understand this novelist who is always talking politics, we must free ourselves of political way of thinking." Due to this insight, Girard praised Stendhal, Flaubert, and Alexis de Tocqueville as being atheists in politics. I do not see that Girard deviated ever from this insight into the mimetic entanglements of most types of party politics. If he would have had the chance to see the last presidential debate in the United States, he would be convinced to be and stay atheist in politics. When I spent in the early 90s a year at Stanford and talked a lot about that, and I was always more interested in politics and social action, I got the impression that he doesn't want to be drawn into partisan battles at all. Interviews with Girard from the late 1980s that were just published in the book The World of René Girard just confirmed the impression that I got there over the whole year. Nadine Dormoy confronted him with Jean-Pierre Dupuy's critique that he is defending the status quo. Girard's response to this critique shows his reluctance to engage in concrete political recipes. I quote Girard, My books do not focus on the question of concrete action. In politics, situations are so mobile that I see no point in taking sides. For me, humans are constantly confronted with concrete decisions, and I don't feel competent to criticize their decisions, unquote. Schwab also emphasized his reluctance to be drawn into party politics and political consequences from his own anthropology, where he addresses in his interviews the work of Ivan Illich. I quote again Girard, Illich is a sociologist who thinks above all about action in the world, whereas I am a theoretician. The consequences to be drawn from my work, I don't see why I should be up to me to do it. Why it should be up to me to do it, unquote. So my second step, Gandhi's active nonviolence complements Schwartz's anthropology, and that goes now directly to what we just heard from Marty. Raimund Schwager, a Swiss Jesuit who became an important partner in Girard's development of his theory in regard to Christianity, was also aware that Girard does not engage in concrete political activities. This becomes clear in a recently discovered letter that Schwager wrote to Girard in April 1983 after Schwager watched Richard Attenborough's film Gandhi. So this letter is not in the collection of his letters because we found 6 more letters just a couple of months ago. In this letter from April 1983, it shows that Schwager was really fascinated by the Gandhi movie, and he writes to Girard, I was very impressed by the Gandhi film. In a way, the spiritual and political strategy complements your thinking. It opens up a third way between a passive attitude which accepts suffering in a resignative or even masochistic way, and an active attitude which easily tips over into aggression, unquote. Schwager understands that any political strategy that takes Girard's mimetic anthropology seriously must avoid the mirroring of violence that so easily leads towards an escalation to extremes. Gandhi's active nonviolence is indeed a strategy that is fully aware of the dangers of mimetic escalation and opts for a third way between a passive non-resistance and an imitation of the aggressor. Studying Gandhi from a Girardian perspective shows that Gandhi's active or even militant nonviolence complements Girard's mimetic anthropology. Both Gandhi and Girard are fully aware of the dangers of mimetic escalation, and both are also not representatives of an absolute pacifism. There are situations when only violent forms of resistance are available. Both Gandhi and Girard are also representatives of a preferential option for nonviolence. So my third and last point, healthy political actions are not impossible. So I show even in Girard you find possibilities that in some way underlines these theses of Schwager, how nonviolent action can complement and has to complement the mimetic anthropology. Despite the fact that Girard's last book, Battling to the End, is his most apocalyptic one because of his insight into the danger of an escalation to extremes that threatens our world of today, this book is at the same time also a book that does not exclude hope and does not claim that good politics is completely impossible. And I read to you a short passage from Battling to the End that was also highlighted by Willy Gutenberger 2 days ago in his paper. And it's an interesting passage. I quote, up to a certain point, we might be in a state of positive undifferentiation, in other words, identified with others. This is Christian love, and it exists in our world. It is even very active. It saves many people, works in hospitals, and even operates in some forms of research. Without this love, the world would have exploded long ago. We should not say that there are no legitimate, healthy political actions. However, politics in itself is powerless to control the rise of negative undifferentiation. It is more than ever up to each one of us to hold back the worst. This is what being means in an eschatological time, unquote. Girard's last book hints also indirectly to the Indian tradition that influenced Gandhi, and I have to admit, although I studied that the last couple of years, I always overlook the context of this passage that I want to read to you. Girard writes, "The twilight of war could result in the worst as it could in the best. There is no destiny involved because humans are entirely able to renounce their violence. Humans are entirely able to renounce their violence. Ancient India had a capacity for renunciation that the West does not imagine. There is an implacable Hindu view on this precisely because that culture does not fear to acknowledge that human activity essentially comes under the category of war. The Iliad is nothing next to the Mahabharata. This is not a question of believing in catastrophe at our cost, or of comparing the number of dead today with that of yesterday in order to bring the seriousness of our time into perspective." Unquote. We have, and that's what I draw from these insights of Girard, we have to be realists in regard to the human potential for violence, but at the same time aware that we humans are not condemned to remain governed by violence and war forever. I would therefore like to finish with an interview Robert Harrison, we saw him yesterday in the movie, conducted with Girard in 2005 when Girard was already working on his book on Clausewitz. So René Girard told Robert Harrison what is he going to do in regard to Clausewitz. And then Harrison, of course, asks the question of this morning. He asks Girard, what do you propose to politicians in order to try to avoid falling into the syndrome of mimetic escalation? And Girard's response to that is very good and may be also give us some orientation for our discussion now. Girard said to Robert Harrison, "It is a complicated question because my vision fundamentally is religious. I believe in non-violence and I believe in the knowledge of violence being able to teach you to reject violence. I believe in the knowledge of violence being able to teach you to reject violence." Thank you very much.
In our last contribution to seeding the conversation that we're going to invite you to engage with us in is Duncan's presentation.
Thanks, Mark. First of all, my life has essentially been living in a place where conflict was a social reality at a level of essentially defining the territory we lived in. And so the question for me has always been, what should we do? How do we do anything? And I suppose I want to say, the thing I'm most grateful for, Girard, and his particular contribution to me is what Jean-Pierre said yesterday, his capacity to reveal what is going on. I think it's actually, so it might seem a little paradoxical. My particular gratitude to Reineke's work is, in fact, he draws our attention to the fact that the crisis is anthropological, not political. And that the question when we're facing politics is how do we transcend politics with an anthropological truth? And that has always been the challenge for all faith traditions. But the question, I suppose, is an anthropological truth is accessible at some level or other to every single one of us, because it belongs to our reality. I suppose the challenge for us, especially in an environment like this, is it is for a lot of people not accessible at the level of the script or the text, but it is, as all religions have known, accessible to people through ritual and through experience together in their lived reality. The first point to say is that mimetic reality is not an invention, it is a discovery. And once it has been named, and once it has been revealed, we have the possibility to see ourselves in the middle of this, and our participation in it, and the possibilities of what might look like useful action actually begin to appear. Because the critical question is not actually to put ourselves into the good space, it is to find a place to act in the world of an escalating mimetic vortex, which does not get fascinated by that, and which finds steps, which it takes in what we're promised, I suppose, if you take a Christian perspective or a Jewish perspective, is another place to start from. You have to start from another place. And the task for us has been not how do we win over politics, but how, with our brothers and sisters in this world, do we engage in a way which brings us back to another reality. So mimeticism for me is not a question of ideological persuasion. It's a question of where do we do our work from? Where do we do our work from? And it does not produce a single technique, in my view. It draws, however, something really important, as certainly in my experience, which is to the critical importance of relationships, both for bad and for good. The human beings do not exist on their own. We react in certain ways with each other, but that our relationships and the quality of our relationships is the critical factor. And as I said, we can only do something if we remain outside the vortex of mimetic desire. And one of the problems, I suppose, with some of the context we now work in is the model obstacle of the scale of the problem. The model obstacle of the scale of the problem paralyzes, rather than says the task remains exactly as it always has been, which is to think about what looks like free action in the world of mimetic minds. And in some sense or other, I think that is not something which is just political, that lives in our families, that lives in our communities, that lives in our politics. Of course, it lives in our politics. But at some level or other, I don't think the task is to be more political than the political. I think it is to call the political back to what it is, which is a potential tool to allow us to work together, rather than simply a task which drives us into escalating to the extremes. So, I mean, two things. I think I cited an example of where I think one of the people who was particularly influential to me came from, which was being in Dresden at a point when it's being mass mobbed. And what do you do? And the conviction that he had, which was, we must do something else, because this choice is right in front of our face. Right in front of our face. So this was a lived experience. This is a choice. The second thing is, maybe until we know what we do, and have a slight complexity with that to the end, because Girard's reliance on Hulda, and to me in the end is a little passive. On the other hand, it may be that contemplation is better, to do something contemplative first is better than to add to the mimetic fire. So I'm not at all, there's certainly a role for the contemplative in bringing this back to the space outside the mimetic, and then working from there in the political space. I think for those of us who come at this still with a Christian language and a Christian experience, I think we have to be very clear that Jesus is a model obstacle in the modern world. He's seen as part of the partisan fight. You're either for him or against him. And that leaves a slight dilemma for me about where freedom comes from. Because how to name where it is for me without causing it for somebody else to be the exact opposite effect. But eventually, I think the truth of these things is in the reality. was this free space or was it not? Did something new happen? And then once that happens, people can move into it. So, just a couple of things before I finish. We have looked for, in the Midlands, is how do we find new places to meet in a new atmosphere, to talk in a new atmosphere, to take decisions from new places, to create an opportunity for and we've developed a method for ourselves as a habit of applying what I would call Girardian analysis. But there are two things exist before Girard and after Girard, and one of them is the mimesis of desire, and the other one is a faith context. And I say this, and I think that the issue of renouncing violence, I mean, in a sense I agree, and in another sense I want to say, the capacity to be able to renounce violence is given to us by somebody else who invites us into the world, because it too is relational. It's not just the capacity to renounce violence is something we take on ourselves because we see our brothers and sisters sitting in front of us. And to be honest, I think this is where the importance of the Jewish tradition, the importance of Jesus, the importance of the Indian community has something here is really, really important. It cannot be, and without that in the world, without going back to the place outside my medical desire, I don't know how we're given it. This is pretty much a faith statement. So the preferential option for non-violence seems to be really important because the issue is not even, so paradoxically, violence. The issue is de-escalating my mimetic vortex. Because violence is not separate from the mimesis of desire. So sometimes, in reality, political structures have existed and have had to use law and a certain kind of force as a mechanism to stop a worse violence. So that was the instrument, I suppose, of the war up to now. The problem we have as we enter the new then is the options for that are getting narrower and narrower and narrower. The possibility of sorting it out that way is narrower and narrower and narrower. But we should take those things we still have, which enabled us to return back to these things like good politics. What worries me, to be honest, about the United States at the moment is more the undermining of the institutions and the possibilities of making decisions. If America elects a president I can live with it as long as he lives within the confines of the institution. What worries me is if the institutions themselves, that we lose the possibility of those institutions as mediating institutions. So good politics is really important. Non-violent direct action, I mean, I think we know people like Gandhi, people like King, people like Willy Brandt going on his knees in Auschwitz, people like Mandela, people like Sadat going to the Knesset. These are moments which appear, which are much more important than their size. They're critical to making it possible to believe that something else is possible. And so for me, non-violent direct action is certainly one of the options. But non-violent direct action, like anything else, can become a trick. It can become a claim to be the good people, as opposed to an invitation into a new world. And for me, that contrast culture, that finding places to meet, is really important. We just, I could last for a long time here, but I think all I want to say to you is the opportunities that each individual or each group or each community has are unique to them. All of us have the question of what would it mean here to act in freedom for my mimetic desire in the situations I face, whether they're domestic, whether they're political, whether they are in universities, because the key issue for me in terms of the anthropological challenge we face is how do we begin to relate to each other from another place which is not simply within the mimetic vortex. And in staring into what the obvious is mimetic vortex, how do we not be paralysed by the scale of the challenge? And here I think Girard offers us actually huge gateway into possibility. I'll leave you with one point. We in Korea, I went to Korea last year. In Korea, the situation is essentially there is no relationship. You're not allowed. There's an absolute nearly nuclear conflict between North and South Korea. And work with some people who really don't know what they could do. But what they started to do was exhibition of children's faces drawn by children in North and South Korea, and then I had an exhibition that they were allowed to put around. That was all they could do. That's all you can do in Korean. You can't. But the bottom line is, it's a chink. It kept the human face alive. It makes a different possibility in the world for me. And I was really, really struck by how small that was. I've worked with the police in transformation of an organisation. I've worked with paramilitaries. I've worked with politicians. But I don't believe my work was any better or bigger than the work that these Korean people were doing, because their commitment in the world was definitely to reduce the mimetic vortex of what was going on. And I think that, and the final thing is, this Korean friend of mine talks about translocal engagement, in which we talk to each other as human beings, not international engagement, not the big international frame, but the frames within which we talk out of our situations with each other. Because each situation is different, but they're mimetically recognizable. They're mimetically recognizable. People recognize mimeticism when it's put in front of them, because it is our reality. And so my experience with this is, this is our challenge. We've developed a program now called, which we call Nurturing Home, which is really about how do we generate places across where people can meet in a different way. And it's very, very interesting to me the degree to which interest has now begun in this, because everybody feels that unless we change the way we relate to each other, the way we're able to meet each other and see each other and recognize each other, unless we change that, all attempts to resolve the political crises we're in are doomed. So just to finish, Girard at one level, and this is where I totally agree with him, cannot be pulled into partisanship. Absolutely not. On the other hand, without the Girardian insight, we will make no progress. We will, let's be as simple as that. Unless we find our way to seeing the face of the victim and receiving forgiveness and understanding that we belong to the ground rather than the good guys on the cross, then unless we understand that, we are actually in a very serious problem. And Girard is for me the key to unlocking the possibility of new human living. Thank you.
So thank you so much. If I do say so myself, I think we've given you stimulating suggestions for your own conversations. I know I have plenty to say. So we're going to, please do not be like my students and take 10 minutes to pick another person to talk to. Just pair up, or if it's not, the math's not right, do 3. And we're going to give you 10 minutes or so to chat amongst yourselves on these questions, to join us in our conversation. And then we would like you to take whatever stands out from your conversations and share with the larger group so that we have a conversation as a whole. So, find your persons to talk with, and you have some time to do that. able to share some of your insights, questions, reflections, so that the small groups can become the larger group and we can go away with many things to think about and continue the conversation after we leave this place. So I'm presuming the mic people who hand them out will hand them out to the first group that would like to share something with others, and then as you have your options of just sharing independently what you've come up with each group, or you could begin yours by responding to pledges. Oh, whatever. I'm not going to micromanage yet. So who is just cannot wait to share what your group is talking about? All right. So we need a mic. Well, he's coming up here.
Well, I'll share only if I can say what Bill and Sue have said. We were talking about relationship on the one hand, and trauma on the other. We're talking about Thich Nhat Hanh's book, Peace is the Way, not the end, it's the way, it's the means. We're talking about Hamlet's goal of revenge, which Bill was reminding us of the essay that Reineke wrote, whereas the lay is the way. But Hamlet discovers at one point, I do not know why I say this thing, since I mean, since we're talking about fear. We take that on Sue was reminding us about fear. And how do you put yourself in a place where relationship is possible? And one of the things that we said is color has made it possible for me personally, and I think for some others perhaps. The fact that we're here talking today about Renee's work still uncover disappears that place. This is that other place that Duncan is one other place that Duncan is talking to us about.
Who wants to build on that and share what your group is saying?
I just want to try to theorize something that I observed and covered. It's a response to what you were talking about with the Graham Rustin, his focus on community. And that community, I think, for him, is made up of relationships between individuals rather than it being a collective. And that kind of showing the distinction between joint agency and collective agency. And I think that creativity comes out of the joints. Collectives are not creative. The joint runs the risk of rivalry, and that it makes us sensitive to what happens between the two, the risk of mimetic rivalry. That too can deal with by finding a third to form a bond over against, to exclude. But there's a simple sort of habit of not doing that. The two in conversation, when the third approaches them, we can choose. We just want to keep our conversation going, or do we want to include this third person? And out of that simple, I think, movement, what can become a habit of creativity arises. There's a simple practice of building community. And I see that. I just see that happening. I think it's reflective of not just, because of people who have lived with mimetic theory and recovered. And it's just a healthy sort of a welcoming dynamic that I feel like is a real nonviolent practice that we do together.
Good morning. I want to share what Alejandro and I talked about. Alejandro from Mexico City, and I'm from LA, California. We talked about the importance of the heterogeneous groups in the community that we saw from the first. And then we talked about cultural appropriation as a form of possibly microaggression or microviolence, but having those discussions and recognizing the anthropology of cultural appropriation, or the need to really move out of your comfort zone consciously and start that dialogue, even if it is a matter. We talked about Black Lives Matter, we talked about gender inequality, but I think our takeaway was the importance of recognizing subtle forms of violence and embracing the conversation with the other and not sticking with likes.
There's one there up front and then in the back too.
Hi, hello. Well, Lucius and I were discussing about how much we admire Gandhi and Martin Luther King, about the important achievements that they got, politically speaking, against the oppression of the state and the violence that they fought against. But we were wondering something that is kind of heavy. That is, the question is, how is this non-violent direct action capable of fighting against non-legitimized violence? Okay, I believe that there's a lot of effectiveness in this type of non-violent struggles against the powers of the state or the powers of institutions. But when we, for example, talk about criminal violence, and this is the case of Mexico, we go for Mexicans, when we think about drug cartels, for example, and that type of violence, which is not a legitimate violence, okay? But it's a violence that is related with criminal activities. We may maybe point or name this violence as the symbolized violence or illegitimate violence. Then it seems that these non-violent strategies, I'm sorry, maybe this is not the term, but these non-violent political strategies are not that effective. When we fight against institutional powers, when we fight against state powers, against the oppression of the state, this non-violent direct action is very effective. But when we think about what happens here in Mexico, for example, with drug cartels, when criminals ask for derecho de piso, for example, for what we call here floor fees, to small businesses that are victims of extortion. And when we deal with these problems, I believe that we have a very heavy issue when we deal with these kind of problems. Thank you.
There's hands up front. I can't see if there's one back there.
Yes.
Okay,
Here.
we'll have that one, and then maybe the mics can come up to the front. Okay.
Okay, so we didn't really come up with any solutions, as Scott told us. But we were thinking about mirroring. You talked about mirroring, Martin, and so we were thinking about being part of the crowd. What does that mean, being part of the crowd? And maybe it starts with the illusion that you are an individual and that you are not part of the crowd. And what happens to Peter is that he discovers that he is not the hero. He's not the individual hero resisting the crowd, but he discovers that he is part of the crowd, and that discovery is the way out of the crowd. The acknowledgement that you are part of the crowd. Then we were also talking about the mirroring, and we thought about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. How can the threat of of violence. Because I learned from Hans Ausfuss, who is a biblical scholar from the University Catholic Louvain, that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, is a warning for the people in power. So, how can the threat of violence be helpful in preventing violence? And maybe it made me think of what the gentleman over here just said about the violence in Mexico. When you're walking around now on the square, you see this heavily armed police force. And it's rather different than what I regularly see in Belgium. So that is something comforting. There's something comforting in that heavily armed police force here. Yeah. So, and then the last thing, we were talking about when you're mirroring the other, then you get enmeshed in the mimetic rivalry, because there is a reconnaissance that you're mirroring each other. But then there is the gesture or the attitude of Jesus, turning the other cheek. Then you're not merely mirroring the behavior of the other, but you become a mirror to the other. So that the other discovers, or you could be the one, the perpetrator, so that you discover your own differences, your own potentialities in being less violent, in your own potentiality to develop an other attitude as a way out of violence, as another way of addressing each other. I think that is what we were talking about.
Oh, this is also so helpful. There were some hands up front. You have the mic. Excellent.
Let's make sure it's working. There we go. Mark and I talked about a number of things, but one thing that seemed particularly important is, and somewhat counterintuitive, is the importance of just awareness and kind of watchfulness that the mimetic theory can give us. That sometimes a major action isn't needed so much as the kind of vigilance of always watching situations locally around us, even if they're not, because situations in violent conflict can snowball very rapidly, but even in very local conflict with friends or colleagues, family, just kind of keeping that vigilance, the awareness, and trying to nip it in the bud anytime that you recognize a spark. Martin said that Reineke, when they were kids, would tell them to try to recognize very, very early when there was even just a very small spark. And sometimes just removing yourself from the situation might be the answer, but it all comes from the mimetic theory helping us be more aware, not so much giving us an exact, maybe even a large impact or large action. It may be as simple as just being aware and kind of quietly removing yourself from the situation.
Were you? Yeah.
Thank you. I was talking with Carlos, and I also mentioned three things that we talked about. One was also that our situations are different, one Mexican, one European. So in Europe we are preoccupied with the Ukraine war and the Israel-Gaza conflict. In Mexico we said it's drug gang violence and the wealthy poor demand. That's really causing the war, so to speak. So very different situations. Then he reminded me actually of one hypothesis that our Innsbruck dramatic theology has drawn, which basically says wherever there is a durable piece which is not built on scapegoating, it is a sure sign that the Holy Spirit is at work. So that's actually, I think, refers back well to what was said, that it's a gift also to be able to get out of the vortex of mimetic violence. Although we then also remarked, it's of course a little vague. How long is durable? how long does there have to be peace? And also, aren't there any hidden scapegoats? But one thought we had, and we also had this as a research topic a couple of years ago in Innsbruck, that the European Union was the attempt after the Second World War to develop such a thing for Europe. And that really the founding fathers in that case, so from Germany, Konrad Adenauer, from France, Robert Schuman, they were engaged Catholics, so engaged Christians that might have played a role. And then the last thing might sound a little bit heretical, it comes from me, so Carlos is out of it. I was thinking back on the first Gulf War, that the first President Bush fought to drive Iraq out of Kuwait, and the general then was Norman Schwarzkopf, who said, you have to go in with overwhelming force. And the heretical thought I have now, isn't going in with overwhelming force also avoiding the vortex? Because the other side has no option of escalating anymore. Of course, we can't do that with Russia because there will always be the danger of nuclear escalation. So it's not a solution really. But I felt, personally, I feel in that first Gulf War, the Americans did the right thing, and they stopped at the right moment. While in the second Gulf War, George Bush's son, W. Bush, there were no reasons for this war, no good reasons, and well, they left a devastated country with much more sources of violence. So that's my area.
Marty here. We talked about how to cultivate less rivalrous spaces and conversations. We started by talking about humility. Humility as a key virtue or ground upon which to have a conversation or a relationship. And that humility involves a certain type of receptivity. So if we think about the mimetic insight, that the movement away from the kind of romantic or false self, where we're engaged in a relationship or conversation where the ego is putting something out and you just have a back and forth where there's no real dialogue. There's just, like what happens in politics, we talk about oftentimes, between different partisans. So there's no real exchange, it's just an ego back and forth. So to actually let go, cultivate some kind of humility which opens up oneself to the other, and ultimately to perhaps the working of the other God, the grace that can be operative, the work of the Holy Spirit, like Nikki talked about, we talked about that here, of opening up a different type of mimetic relationship or vortex or something like that. So I think they were kind of the main. Oh yeah, and George, that was a very good point, that religious practices help us to cultivate this openness, this humility. So thinking about different types of spiritualities or religious practices that, like Wolfgang mentioned, I think in India, ancient India, or Duncan, I can't remember, the capacity for non-violence being cultivated through ancient Indian practice, Hindu or Buddhist. We could think about that, say, within the Christian tradition. Ignatian practice I can think of, which is about, you know, the letting go of the self, letting go of false attachments, and opening myself up to the workings of grace, etc. So, and true freedom, like Duncan talks about, the cultivation of a true space of freedom through those spiritual practices.
So we want to bring it back to us in a minute. So this is going to be last call on if there's a couple of you who've been holding back. Yeah. So let's get a couple more. And then, there's one up here, and then I can't see back there.
Okay.
Okay.
We talk about something that Dupuy said about the difference between peace and justice. Maybe peace is only the lack of violence, and injustice is a process that is mandatory to listen to the other and to negotiate. So this is the base to politics. So that's maybe.
So there is one up here, right? There's one here, and I can see that there. So, okay, there's the one there.
Earlier in a different conversation, it came up, and I was keen to bring it up. You know, it came up the understanding, or what I've come across at least, the understanding of G.R. Freud, right, where he thinks about the sacrifice of the father, purely scapegoating. He thinks about the feasting of the father as a purely scapegoating mechanism to restore, right, balance in society. Where I feel that the reading lacks the element of introjection, the feasting on father, or the eating of the totemic animal in the Strauss, where all that aggression and all that is introjected. So the mechanism of restoring balance is not just one of projection into the scapegoat, but also introjecting back, which means establishing an internal relation with that which we have done, right? Hereafter, which is perhaps also another way to think about what other options might there be out there.
Okay, so you got it, very good. You're it, I think, so.
I kept a lot of things only to add to the conversation. We focus on forgiveness in our conversation. As yesterday, by the end of the commentary, we focus also on the something thing else, on the conversion that happens after, by the end, as an awareness of, not as a recognition of oneself not as a victim, but as a prosecutor. And we also, in our conversation, came out that in some situations, even if you have a strong background and you are aware that the importance of forgiveness and you are willing to forgive, sometimes what happens is that you are not able to forgive. And then a violent situation, we keep our conversation in a very personal sphere, but the violence on the relationships is there. I mean, it's very difficult to forgive when a brother, father, mother, a sister, a close friend, because of certain situations. And then we finish with this conception of forgiveness, not taking it as something that we have to do, an habit, but more than thinking of it as a gift, as something that you receive. You have to be ready, of course, and I agree with all the habits that you have used to be ready to receive this grace, but by the end of it, it's a question of grace also. It has some role, and the phenomenology of donation, of love, to make it happen. And to look at me not only with the eyes of the others, in a mimetic way, but start to look at me with my own eyes, my inside. And also I was thinking in St. Augustine, the interior gaze, I mean, to look to us from the interior, from our intimacy and our relationship with that. And that's
So this has really been so insightful. What I'd like to do in the end is to give back to you some mirroring, but maybe in a positive way. In psychoanalysis can be very dangerous and problematic to people. And Julia Kristeva has always said that psychoanalysis done well the analyst removes themselves from the position of the one who is supposed to know, empties that space out. And the three things that I heard from you that emptied out my space as one who is supposed to know, and the three things I hadn't really thought about that I'm going to take away to ponder is one, a comment on how nonviolence is associated with the threat of violence. And of course, the March on Washington was nonviolent, and it changed the law, very important laws in the United States. But the argument that was made to the president was that when you have 1 million people show up on the lawn there, that's a threat. And so the power of nonviolence, I hadn't thought of that part of the story. The second thing that I'm going to reflect on from what was said is the talk about the sacrifice of the father and the incorporation, and it reminded me of the comment made yesterday about the metabolizing of violence from the book Mirror Medusa. Metabolizing actually is a digestive function, right? And I've been struggling with what would it mean to metabolize violence in a way that transformed it. And so I think that fits together with what was just said, and it's going to help me move forward. And then the final thing from, you probably wonder what we were talking about. We were talking again, and it was already mentioned, you spend your lifetime studying Girard, and then you watch him on film, and he says something, and you go, I never thought of that before. And it was the whole Peter conversation. And the notion that Peter is the rock on which I will build the church, that was taken up into the mimetic vortex, and this was Duncan's point in our conversation. And yet, what we heard from one of you and what we talked about was Peter's recognition was becoming one of the crowd and an awareness of, if we become aware of the Peter awareness of something very different than the rock. Okay, so what did you hear that you want to respond to in our brief time left?
I heard a lot, but I focus maybe on the challenging question to concepts of nonviolence by Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and situations of non-legitimate violence, the difference between some European countries and Mexico, the role of police. I said consciously, and it's very important, I talked about the preferential option for nonviolence. So absolute pacifism, nonviolence in any case is wrong. Gandhi was aware of that, Girard was aware of that. The most interesting thing about Gandhi is when the Second World War broke out and Poland resisted militarily against the troops of Hitler, Gandhi called that resistance almost non-violent. So if you have a black and white concept in your mind between violence and non-violence, you would say Gandhi didn't understand the thing. But Gandhi was very pragmatic and always said we should try in every case as much non-violence as possible, but there are cases it's not possible. I mean, Gandhi was aware that in our societies, police has to play a role. Police can be also getting in the wrong direction. Police can be also trying to be as non-violent as possible. So I think it's very important always to look at the potentials, and there are some quite very good empirical studies by Erika Chenoweth and Maria Stefan why civil resistance works. She shows in the last 60 years there are many cases all over the world, empirical examples, where non-violent resistance was more than double more successful and long-standing than violent resistance. But to discuss a special case, we always have to look on the possible potentials. Maybe to Nikki's challenge, I would just say back again, of course, the first Gulf War was much, much better than the second Gulf War. But we should not forget that Pope John Paul II, who was not a pacifist and who was not a weak in political questions, was against even the first Gulf War because he thought the means to come up with a non-violent solution have not all been tried. And we don't know, maybe the whole situation would have developed in a better way if we tried, but we don't know. We should look pragmatically on it. Maybe one example from Nelson Mandela, because that shows how political leadership is very important to not give the power to the extremists. In just example, in 1993, a right-wing extremist killed Chris Hani, the most likely successor of Mandela, who had a very good reputation among the black society in South Africa. He was killed with the calculation a big civil war will break out and the whole development towards democracy and free South Africa would be completely derailed. And at that moment, Mandela stepped in, created 1 week of protests, discussions, all the means in order to channel the emotion of the people who were really angry and were ready to go into a civil war. So you see that is a very important, it's very important what a political leader in such a situation does or not. I think that is a little bit lacking in recent years in Israel and Palestine, where you have the feeling both on the side of Israel as well as on the side of the Palestinians that extremists are able to take over the situation of the whole country.
Thank you. So we're going to run 2 minutes over, and I'm setting the timer for Duncan. I don't know.
We have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Okay, and he's going to take us out with his thoughts.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm just looking at the list here, there's so many different points here, but one is, I think, to go one of the early points is GRR's my massive part is, one of the things is this organisation, it is created because people recognise the real importance here. It's not simply a mathematical puzzle, and one of the reasons why the atmosphere is slightly different. So I think that's really important to say. This is also a mimetic movement here, trying to move towards a different place to start with. I want to also answer this question of non-violent direct action. Non-violent direct action in some ways emerged as a way to hold government to account. It was simply to say, do your job. Do your job. And the effective capacity of Gandhi and then of King was to, by contrasting the way they were, the oppression that they were facing, create an impossible moral dilemma for the governments who wanted themselves to be upheld as, like words, Christian governments, but governments within an ethical framework. And I think when you talk about Mexico, one of the things I would say to you is this. First of all, I don't think GRR is first effectiveness. I don't think it always works. The story of Jesus in the Bible is an abject failure at the political level. The point of the thing is, in some ways, is that beyond that is something else. So for me, doing what needs to be done is the first task. And we will see where it's effective. And both Jewish and Christian traditions put the outcome in the hands of God. Your task is to do your job. Your task is to do your job. And at some level or other, I think that means, what that means in practice, I understand is incredibly difficult. Working with paramilitary organisations, working with groups, there are times when it's possible and there are times when it's not. My experience is there was a long time when it really was not possible to do very much. And then all of a sudden it was possible to do something. And all that has to be retained in a sense for me is, and horrific though it is, these are human beings too, and they too will come back to this. That's the statement of faith, but it is my view that the mimetic theory speaks to human beings at their core. And then the last thing I would say is, I think the point about watchfulness that somebody raised here about GRR's capacity to create watchfulness, that is actually exactly the same as ritual in religions. The point is to get prepared for when it gets big. So we are taught to be grateful, we're taught to be repentant, we're taught to think about forgiveness, we're taught to learn, and though we don't know everything, we're taught about thinking about other people and all of these things. Losing that in our communities is really quite difficult, I think. One of the big losses is the ritual repetition of that as critical. So one of the things we might need to speak about is how do we create support places like that where those are put front that not obligations, although they become obligations, it is. I had a really interesting meeting with some young people about forgiving, and I use the word forgiving rather than forgiveness, because forgiveness becomes an it. But I said to them, listen, to forgive is not a law. It is a possibility. It is your possibility through freedom. You don't have to choose it, it's perfectly fine. Everybody understands why this is not a forgivable act. And for me, the healing of trauma is only possible in a new relationship. Trauma, and when it is transcended, it cannot be pushed down, it cannot be ignored, it has to be transcended. But the trauma is not the story of your life. And the healing is the possibility that there is life beyond trauma. So it's not, the focus is not on the trauma, the focus has to be on, so we're all traumatized people. What do we do? How do we find our way to walk forward? And the Girardian moment is this thing about choosing. It is, we have a choice. We can't stay. We can't stay. It's perfectly okay in a way. It's not okay, of course, it's leading us to disaster. But it is. But we can, in my view, what he taught me to say was that we do face a choice, and we'll have to take that choice. And nobody can make it for us. But actually, it's wonderful when you get to the other side. And it isn't just a law and an obligation. It is the land built on it, as the Bible has it. That is what the land of the milk and honey is. It's on the other side. And Levinas's insistence that you move from equality to your absolute obligation to the other is the ethical move. And then you can't be anything other than equal once you get to that kind of reciprocity. Thanks.